Thank you very much for joining us. I'm David Barrell, Executive Director of the MIT Initiative on the Digital Economy. Thank you very much for joining us today and all semester. We've had a pretty amazing seminar series this term. This is the last session for the fall term. We'll start up again the first week of February, so we'll send out invites for that in a couple of weeks hence. We're very lucky today to have Zoe Cullen with us. She's Assistant Professor at Harvard Business School. She's focused on the design of labor markets and the choices of employers and labor platforms that affect matters of public interest, such as pay transparency and pay inequality. And in fact, that's the primary subject of her talk today, What's My Employee Worth? And the effects of salary benchmarking. Zoe, take it away. Thanks for joining us. Oh, and just logistics, feel free to push your questions into the chat. Zoe will make a few pauses now and again to give an opportunity for clarifying questions. But otherwise, throw your video off and your audio off and listen until we get to Q&A. Thanks very much. Zoe, welcome.
Thank you very much. Yeah, so it's an absolute pleasure to be giving this talk, and it is indeed about the operations of labor markets, and in particular the way information, what I'll be referring to as salary benchmarking, affects how labor markets operate. And you'll notice that salary benchmarking is actually one of several data analytics tools that many large companies have been rolling out. So this is also a talk about the impact of data analytics on how firms are making decisions about pay and hiring. All right, so let me also point out this is joint work with my colleague Shengwu Li, who's in the Harvard Economics Department, and Ricardo Price-Truglia, who's at UC Berkeley. It seems that I don't have the ability to flip through anymore. Oh, there we go. All right, so let me start by pointing out that the motivation for this is the fact that employee pay is, for most organizations, the largest source of expenditure. So firms are spending a fair amount of time and resources selecting the right salary for their employees. In the US, we have legislation that prohibits an employer from sharing information directly with their competing firms. And the reason is that if they were to talk to each other about salaries or compensation, they might have an opportunity to collude and set wages that were lower than otherwise. So there's legislation prohibiting that, but it's still the case that companies are allowed to access aggregated market wage data, and it's provided by third parties. It's a very popular practice, and so it has a term that is colloquially used for it called salary benchmarking. Despite the widespread use of benchmarking, there's no evidence on its effects. And so today's presentation is going to be about how do salary benchmarks affect pay setting, and what can it teach us about how labor markets are operating in practice. And then it's also relevant for an ongoing policy debate. So here I'm referencing the Biden executive order from July 2021, which was looking into anti-competitive practices in the labor market in the US. And among three ideas that the administration had, one was revisiting what the guidelines are for sharing salary information, particularly because these third-party data aggregators have become so prevalent. And that is in part because the internet has made it so accessible for the collection of salary information and making that transparent to a wide variety of firms. All right, so I will speak to that policy debate as well. All right, and then the way this presentation proceeds is first I'm just going to offer a model that helps rationalize why firms are interested in benchmarking information to begin with. And then it's going to yield predictions for what the effects of benchmarking are going to be. And then I'm going to study the actual effects of benchmarking, and this time using administrative data. And the administrative data is from a very large payroll processing firm that created its own benchmarking tool. So it created a salary benchmark, and we see the rollout of that benchmarking tool. And so that process gives us the opportunity to have an event study analysis that gives us this causal identification for how salary benchmarking influences the way salaries are set, and also the way employees are hired and how long they stay at the firm. And I'll argue that there's significant effects on pay setting, and we'll go into the implications. Okay, so then to just give you a sense of where this fits in the literature, it's of course closely connected to a broader literature on pay transparency. Now, I say broader, but in fact, all these papers that are listed and that have identified as evidence on pay transparency's effects are focused on employee information. So the channel through which pay transparency affects anything is through updating beliefs of workers. And this is a departure from that, in the sense that here we're really strictly focused on information frictions on the employer side. So employees are not going to have access to the salary benchmarking tool that we're studying. There's also a rich literature on why two similar workers are getting paid differently after accepting jobs at different firms. So initially, this literature was sort of coalesced around this idea that employees it's costly for them to seek out job offers, and so they're only going to actually collect information about a subset of outside options. And the fact that they only collect a small amount of information is going to lead to a wage setting game on the employer side that accounts for dispersed wages. And more recently, many authors have tried to sort of just, from a reduced form perspective, measure what each firm's premium is, and then sort of map it back to potential reasons. So, rent sharing is one very popular explanation. This is the way I view the paper I'm about to show you, is that you'll see how information frictions alone are introducing a lot of variation in wages, even for similar workers. So this is really yet another channel that we think can explain a fair amount of inequality that we see. And then there's an important literature on behavioral firms that's, I would say, rapidly growing. And here there's a range of reasons why firms may not look like they're sort of profit maximizing agents in a competitive market. Some papers have written about how firms anchor on a particular set of prices. Others have really focused on managerial misoptimization. And so, in fact, these papers, sort of the theme here is that firms have a hard time optimizing for one reason or another. And again, this is sort of distinct from frictions that are information-based. So a firm just, it cannot access the necessary information to make what would look like the optimal decisions in a competitive market. And then I'll just point out that our model is building quite heavily on this Milgram and Weber 1982 paper. So this is the introduction of the linkage principle that sort of lays out what happens when you get a public signal of what other firms are bidding in a marketplace. And so that kind of auction model is going to be the foundation of what I described to you in just a few slides. And then perhaps the closest paper to ours is the Grennan and Swanson paper that takes place in the hospital setting. And it's looking at what happens when hospitals gain access to price information for heart stents. And the question is, how does it affect the way they negotiate for heart stents? And so there they find downward pressure on prices. And that's perhaps the closest to our setting. Okay, so let me pause here. I'm going to jump right into institutional context. But if there are any questions, please, by all means, feel free to interrupt me. Okay, so the way we started was by conducting a survey of HR managers. And the HR manager pool came from the Society of Human Resource Management Society. So this is just like a group of 300,000 professionals in the US who were willing to receive emails from their organization. And we have 1,600 responding. And a strong majority of them report using salary benchmarks to set pay. So 84% of employers claim to be using it at the time they set pay. And it's consistent with interviews by a sociologist, Adler, who actually does these open-ended interviews and finds the same result. And then you can see it in HR textbooks. If you just look to chapters on pay setting, there's entire chapters that are dedicated to how would you use the salary benchmark. In the US context, it dates back to the 1980s when many larger consulting firms rose in popularity. So Korn Ferry and Hayes Group are examples of firms that essentially created salary benchmarks by asking individual clients to reveal their pay information and then share it with their other clients. It was a give to get model. So those were sort of exclusive benchmarks that were passed around to clients. And then we have more recent evidence of online tools that are actually quite popular, probably even among people here in the audience. So Glassdoor is among the most well-known, and Glassdoor is a user-generated salary benchmark. So people can anonymously contribute information about their employer and the salaries that they're paid. And then to access it, all you have to do is be willing to offer some of your own information. So these are all existing at the time that our partner decides to enter the marketplace. So in 2016, the largest US payroll services company designed its own benchmarking tool. So this is ADP, and it has a market cap of $72 billion. And they serve 650,000 firms, so 20 million employees. They're really massive. And the data are administrative data because their primary business is to just process paychecks. So as a consequence, they are able to essentially have this high frequency, very accurate salary benchmark that they make available to their own clients. Okay, this is what it looks like. So if you were to log into their tool, I'm showing you an example of what that web portal looks like. And at the top, you can see that it's popular to start by putting in entering a position title. So here we've used as an example, accountant. And then you can see there's also several filters that you can add on top of this. And so you add these filters, you can select a state or a particular industry. And then after doing that, you get to see this wage distribution. So here you can see that the median is highlighted in purple, but it's also reporting the 10th, 25th, 75th, 90th percentile of the distribution. So this would be sort of accountants in Massachusetts in the insurance industry. So that's sort of the granularity. And then you can see there's still quite a few people in that cell. So on the left, it shows you how well populated this particular benchmark is. Okay, so this is what the employers see. And now I'm going to transition to describing why an employer might spend so much time looking at these data. So the first thing I want to point out is that most of the workhorse models we have of a labor market, we have to depart with because they assume that employers have perfect information about the outside options of their employees. So basically the wages in the marketplace. And it's actually quite popular to think about the labor market this way, where workers collect outside options or outside opportunities. And then if they are considering leaving for another job, they would just bring that information to the employer. And then the employer has a chance to respond. So that's a world in which employers have perfect information, and it wouldn't make any sense for them to start paying for aggregate wage data. So what we're going to do is turn to a class of models where there can be this aggregate uncertainty about wages. And in addition, the firms are going to strategically interact. So the wage information of other firms is going to make a difference for one firm's choices. So I want you to think about an auction where firms are bidding on a worker. Firms privately know the value for the worker, and that's where the uncertainty comes in. So you know what the worker is worth to you, but you don't know what the worker is worth to other firms. And it's going to be in a first price auction. So the highest bidder, the firm that offers the highest salary, is going to secure that employment relationship, which means that they're going to trade off lowering the wage a little bit and lowering the probability that the employee accepts that position. It also means that if in a dynamic version of this game, that if the firm is not only worried about firms they compete with today, but also firms that might come in and be interested in this worker 2 or 3 or 4 months down the line, they're trading off lowering the wage a little bit today in the auction with the probability that this worker gets poached. So they're also concerned about retention in the future. And the third feature of this auction is that there's a correlation between workers' values across firms. And that's really important because when people are looking at a salary benchmark, what they're really looking at is what happened in past auctions. And it can be an entirely disjoint set of firms. It can be a different set of workers. And for that information to actually be informative about what's going to happen in today's auction, there has to be a form of correlation between those bids. And so we're going to assume that workers have a strong form of positive correlation, and that's the affiliation condition.
Zoe, is this workers past, is it the firm's values of the worker is correlated? Or is it like across workers? It's like within a worker, other firms would have correlated values for you, the worker?
Yeah, it actually, so in our empirical setting, what's important is affiliation, as you describe, of a worker's value to various different firms. And it also has to be the case that within a position title, within a marketplace, so basically the level of granularity that employers can see using the benchmark, which is going to be position, industry, and state. It has to be the case that workers within that group also have affiliated values with each other. That's the two senses in which it really matters.
Thank you.
Like the specific form of correlation is, like the choice of the modeler. I don't, in some sense, this helps with tractability, but of course, what matters here is just that the value of a janitor to another firm in a past period actually says something about what a different janitor might be, what wages they might secure today. Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay, and so in this context, it's optimal to bid below one's valuation. And that's just, it follows from the fact that if you were to take the private value for the worker and bid exactly that amount, you guarantee yourself 0 profits. So we know that the firm is going to shade their bid, and whether to shade the bid a little bit or a lot depends on what the firm thinks the market value for that worker is going to be. So this is why salary benchmark information is going to be so useful. It's going to help them figure out how much to shade. Okay, so this is sort of a quote from an HR textbook, and the quote helps just highlight how HR professionals are thinking about this problem. So I will read it, even though, so we'll all read it along together, I suppose. Using surveys to benchmark compensation levels ensures that the pay levels determined by the organization are not extraordinarily misaligned with market practice. So pay is not too low, it's not too high, and determining the appropriate amount of compensation is a balancing act. So no organization wants to waste their financial resources by paying too high relative to the market, and those who pay too low risk unwanted turnover from employees looking for a better deal elsewhere. And actually this last clause here, risking unwanted turnover from employees, that's sort of prima facie evidence that the employer can't just rely on the fact that employees are going to return to them with these outside offers at a later date and say, like, do you want to match this or not? So they have to sort of anticipate it ahead of time and choose wages to prevent it. So this is sort of the way we think our model is also working, or these forces are also being captured in our model. And now I can, now I can turn to this question of what happens when a firm gets access to benchmark information in the context of this auction. Okay, so the first prediction. So here, to be clear, the benchmark information is going to be a signal that has also to be at least correlated with the transaction values of those past auctions. So these are the salaries that have been documented, and these are the ones that will be seen in the distribution that I showed you. So what happens when that signal is shared with one of the firms? The first is that salaries get compressed, and I have compressed in quotation marks here because before you make any predictions or any assumptions about the distribution of values for the firm, what we can show is that salaries will they'll get compressed from above. So firms that already thought they would secure the employment relationship with high probability, when they see a high signal for the benchmark, they're less likely to shift their wages up. They already expect to secure these relationships, but if they see a low signal, they're going to shift their wages down. And it's that asymmetric updating to high and low information or high and low signals that's going to result in compression from above. And then if you make some distributional assumptions about the firm's values, then you also get compression from below. So the distributional assumptions that we've looked at closely are the ones that sort of map back to what distributions of wages that we see in the data. And so a log normal, for example, will lead to compression from both above and below. Okay, the second prediction is that salaries, in response to seeing the benchmark, they're going to move or become more compressed, especially in positions where workers' contribution is highly standard across firms. So this is the case where the benchmark is especially informative because the form of correlation in values is going to be strongest. And that's, so this empirically, what this is going to mean is that when we restrict our attention to positions where we think workers are highly substitutable, that's going to be the case. That's going to help us see where our results are coming from. So where the compression is primarily coming from. Okay, and then the third prediction is that average salaries could go up, they could go down, or they could stay the same, again, depending on the distribution of firm values. So this is our prediction for what happens to salary levels when one firm gains access to the benchmarking tool. And if you take our model seriously and ask what happens when all firms gain access to the benchmarking tool, so what are the equilibrium effects, then you have a scenario where prediction 3 is actually that average salaries are going to go up. And that's sort of the fundamental insight from the linkage principle, this 1982 paper that I was describing. So and it's been shown in other auction sets. So if you have an auction and everyone's bidding on a price and it's publicly revealed some information about what others might bid, then you see that there's more competitive pressure between those firms. Okay, so now let me move to the data and research design. So we're going to connect 3 independent data sets. The first is going to be this payroll database. So the payroll records are going to just be high frequency information about what salary is paid. We're going to see employee position titles mapped back to each firm when they're hired and then when they depart from the firm. And we're going to link that to the search database that we see employers using when they enter the benchmark tool. So this is going to let us see how they, the position title that they enter, and it's going to have a timestamp and then a user ID. That means we can link what one firm's search behavior is to the payroll data and see who they hired and for which pay. And then lastly, there's the benchmark database that lets us reconstruct what the employer saw at the time that they searched the benchmark tool. So those 3 data sets are going to let us make a causal statement about the impact access to this benchmark tool has had on pay setting. All right, so we see slow and steady adoption since the inception of the tool, which is in the final quarter of 2015. And our analysis is going to run right up until the start of the pandemic, so January 2020. Anecdotally, who adopts this tool and when they adopt is largely arbitrary. So my co-authors and I had the opportunity to essentially nudge or grant access to this tool to a random set of firms that didn't already access this tool. But when we looked at the historical data, so just the early rollout period, it was fairly convincing to us that the way that this firm had done it was as good as random. So we decided this experiment was wholly unnecessary, and I'll spend a good amount of the presentation giving you the same set of details that we observed that give us confidence that the way that they were doing this didn't lead to a degree, it didn't lead to the types of selection you might worry about. So the way it was rolled out was the managers, these account managers that operate in ADP, but on behalf of clients, were told to describe this exciting new data analytics tool whenever a client called in about anything else. So the client might be concerned for one reason or another about their payroll management, and they have very active relationships with these account managers. And then at that time, this account manager would describe the tool and also price it at a really almost a negligible amount. So about $1 per head for a large company, the small relative to what they were paying ADP already. So this process of adoption led to 586 firms that gain access to the tool in our window. So between the December of 2015 and January 2020. And then we take these treatment firms and we map them back to control firms. So in the pool of 650,000 ADP firms, we match them on size, state, and characteristic. Size, state, and industry. And of course, I mentioned this is going to be an event study analysis that revolves around the exact onboarding date of a firm, so the date that they get access. And by definition, our control firms don't have an obvious onboarding date. So what we'll do for the control firms is to assign them a placebo onboarding date. And the way we do that is just by taking the treatment firm that's most similar to the control firm in terms of observables, and assuming that they gained access at the same time. So the example is that if Ford gained access, but Fiat did not, then we would assume Fiat would have gained access when Ford did. Okay, so because ADP serves primarily medium and large firms, our sample is skewed towards larger firms. So we start to match the US Census in terms of number of employees and the salaries only when you get close to the 30th percentile. So you should think about this as like 30th percentile firms and above is well represented in the sample. And by design, our treatment and control firms are very similar because we've gone through this matching procedure, but they're also similar along the characteristics that we didn't directly match on. All right, so now I want to give you an example of utilization of this tool, okay? Because once you gain access, it's not the case that a firm always uses it, on a regular basis for every particular hire. So to give you a sense of what utilization is like, there's 534 firms that gain access to this tool before 2019 Q4. So that's just one particular example quarter. And of those firms, 37% of them hire in at least one position in that quarter. And then of those firms that hire, they looked up the salary for 20% of these new hires. So that's going to give us some new hires who are hired by firms that had access to the tool and could have searched, but didn't search. And then there's going to be other firms that had access to the tool, they could search and did end up searching for the salaries for these particular hires.
Do you know what the difference was between firms that did and didn't use it? I could imagine them being quite different.
The ones that just decided to search.
Decided to search and not, yeah.
Well, so there's, here I'm making the distinction about firms at the firm position level. So firms that search for a particular position, but might not search for for a different position. So about 98% of firms who gain access search for at least one
At
position.
some point.
Yeah, at some point. But there is variation in the position titles that they
In the
do.
position.
And you wouldn't ex ante think that that's, random. You would think maybe there are reasons to be searching for some positions and not others. But you will get to see very clearly what the characteristics of how they are trending over time for these different types of positions. Okay, so each new hire is going to be assigned to one of these categories. So either it's a new hire that was in a searched position, and this means that they are hired into a firm that had access, and at some point searches the salary benchmark for that particular position. And it's not just a position, it's actually a position in a labor market, a position, state, industry. And then there are new hires that are categorized as non-searched. These are the positions that are, where the new hire is hired by a firm that does have access, but the firm just never searched for that particular position in that labor market. And then there are non-searchable positions. So this is the set of control firms where the firm didn't have access. And so everybody who's hired into these control firms is in a non-searchable position. And these three categories are going to help with our event study analysis. So I'm going to go into details about how these, these pre-treatment characteristics look across all three categories. And I'm going to do it in a graphic form in a moment. So let me first just show you, this is what the raw data, to give you a sense of what the raw data look like. These are the most popular searches that we see. So right up at the top is bank teller. And you can see that in the first column, there's 539 newly hired bank tellers in our data. And in square brackets there's 12 firms that searched for these 539 bank tellers. But also in our data, there are 287 newly hired bank tellers hired at firms that could have searched, but 24 of those firms never searched for bank teller. And then there's going to be 2,000 of these bank tellers newly hired who are at these control firms. So these 87 control firms never searched. So these are non-searchable positions. And I'm just going to show you how wages evolve in each of these categories over time. Okay, so to do that, let me just start with non-parametric evidence on what wage compression looks like in this environment. So the x-axis here is going to be the percent difference between the salary of a new hire and the median of the benchmark that they saw. So here at the 0 is going to be a new hire that's paid exactly the median of the benchmark. And this is the distribution of those, so the distribution of those new hire wages, relative to the benchmark, in the 5 months before the firm gains access to the benchmarking tool. And I'm only showing you positions that are eventually searched. So they will be searched, but they have not been in this period because the firm didn't yet have access. And I'm using a summary statistic for wage dispersion here. So 19.8% is just the absolute value of the x-axis here. So it's considered the mean absolute deviation. You can think of the benchmark, the median of the benchmark is actually just like the median of the population. So it's really just a measure of dispersion that you can look at in any data set. And it starts at around 20%. And then after the benchmark tool is accessible, in the searched positions, that measure of dispersion falls by a full 5 percentage points. So that represents a 25% decline in wage dispersion for new hires in these searched positions. And you can also see in the distribution, there's quite a lot of piling up right at the median, which it's like almost doubles the probability that you're paid exactly the median wage. All right, now I'm going to just do the same exercise, but I'm going to be showing you the non-searched positions. So these are still firms that eventually gain access to the tool. This is the 5 months before they actually gain access. You can see that dispersion is still around 20% in the non-searched positions. And then here you can see after the firm gains access to the tool in the 5 subsequent months, the distribution changes very little. Okay, and then we can do it one last time in the non-searchable position. So these are control firms, and I'm showing you the 5 months before that placebo onboarding date. And here you see again that the dispersion looks like it hovers around 20%. And then afterwards, the distribution doesn't change very much. So this is the basis for moving forward to sort of formalizing the impact of searching for these positions. So we can move now to a more familiar event study framework where the x-axis, or sorry, let's start with the y-axis, sorry, so the dependent variable here, this yijt, is going to be the dependent variable that was just at the x-axis we've just looked at. So the absolute distance to the benchmark, and it's going to be for worker I at firm J, time t. Time is going to be indexed by the quarter. And there's going to be event study dummies that just pick up how this outcome variable is evolving over time leading up to the access date and then subsequently. We're always going to have position level fixed effects. There's going to be time fixed effects at the monthly level. And then here the standard error is always going to be clustered by the firm, position, and quarter. And we're going to always compare. I'm going to show you side by side what happens when we look within firms that gain access. So all the firms are treated, but we're going to compare searched versus non-searched positions. And then separately, I'll show you what treatment and control firms look like, how they compare when we look at searched and non-searchable positions. So now the x-axis here is the quarters relative to the benchmark onboarding date. So you can see for the non-searched positions, it hovers around 20% right up before access. Afterwards, it continues on, again, right around 20%. And then for the searched positions, this is what's so critical for the causal interpretation. You can see that before the firm gains access, they actually follow very similar trajectory when it comes to the dispersion in salaries. And only afterwards do you see a stark decline. So this is the difference between these two is what we are describing as the causal effect of gaining access to the salary benchmark. And you can see that the difference between these two lines looks like this. So again, this 5 percentage point decline that translates into a 25% decline in dispersion. And then here we can do the same for the treatment versus control firms. So this is searched versus non-searchable positions. And you can see a very similar pattern. In fact, when we take the difference between those two lines, we recover a very similar point estimate. Okay, so if we were to just make many different choices for the exact specification, you can see that the point estimates for both the searched versus non-searchable and searched versus non-searched, they do move around, but they range between about a 3 percentage point decline to about a 7 percentage point decline. And they're, it's always quite distant from zero effect, regardless of the different choices we could make for this event study regression. Okay, so now I want to turn to this prediction number 2 that I described, which is that not only will we see salary compression when we see the benchmark, but it's going to primarily come from positions where workers are considered to be highly substitutable. These are the cases where we think the benchmark is going to be especially informative. So now I'm going to just split the sample by low skill and high skill. And our low skill jobs, in this particular case that I showed you, we're restricting to those that require no more than a high school diploma. And those that employ younger workers, so have workers on average 31 or younger, and with modest pay. So the here, I think we cut at $30,000. And it's actually, what I'm about to show you is not sensitive to how you define low skill versus high skill. We're just trying to cut the sample essentially in half. So you can see where the effects are predominantly coming from. So 42% of the sample is going to be classified here as low skill, and it's going to include the bank teller positions, customer service representatives, and receptionists. The other 58% are going to be categorized as high skill. So these are the software developers, technicians, engineers. And I'm going to start by just showing you that first set of histograms for the high skill positions. So it's here you can see the gray histogram is going to be the 5 months before access among searched positions. And then in red, it shows you how the distribution shifts in the 5 months after 5 months after the firm has access. So here the interpretation is that, you know, there is some shrinkage in the sense that the dispersion starts at a bit higher, 24%, probably representing some heterogeneous quality among workers in these high skill positions. And then it falls to about 20.5%. So this represents a 14% drop in wage dispersion. But then if you look at the low skill positions, the dispersion starts out at 14.5%. So it's already somewhat more compressed than in the high skill positions. But there's a very dramatic response to the benchmark. So it drops from 14.5% down to 8.7%. So this represents a 40% decline in wage dispersion of new hires. Okay. So now let me turn to the effect on salary levels. Okay, so I'm just jumping right ahead to the event study specification. I've swapped out the y-axis. Instead of looking at absolute dispersion from the median, we're now looking at the log salary. And here, the main point I want to make is that salaries don't appear to go down after the firm gains access to the benchmark. And that's sort of the important policy question, is, you know, are these benchmarks leading to lower wages than we would otherwise expect? So we see a small positive boost that's statistically insignificant. And now if we compare, again, searched versus non-searchable, so treatment and control, you see roughly the same sized effect. And again, not statistically significant, but positive. And if we look across all these specifications, you can see that our point estimates hover, you know, either close to 0 or just above 0, but they rarely dip far into negative territory. Now, this particular sample is masking the heterogeneity that you might anticipate based on what I showed you earlier between high versus low skill. So if we again split the sample by low skill and high skill, in the top half, so in the upper panel, you can see that in fact, the low skilled workers for whom there was significant compression, they're also experiencing a 6.7% boost in salaries, average salaries. And that is highly statistically significant. If you look down below at the high skilled group, the average salaries are fairly constant over time. And so, so in fact, for the low skill group, we see some positive wage gains. And then if we now switch our the y-axis, instead of looking at log salaries, if we look at the likelihood that you're still a new hire still at the firm 1 full year after they've been hired, now we can have a measure of retention. And remember, this came up in the HR quote that we read. So, you don't want to pay too high or too low relative to market. If you pay too low, you might risk unwanted turnover. And here we see that after firms adopt the salary benchmarking tool for the low skill positions, the likelihood that the worker makes it to the end of the year rises from 41% up to about 48%. So that represents about a 16.5% increase in the likelihood that you make it to the end of the year. And then you see, perhaps not so surprisingly, among the high skill group, this retention measure is actually fairly constant before and after access. Okay, so now let me just conclude, and then I'll open it up for questions. So in this presentation, we documented the widespread use of salary benchmarking and provided the first evidence on its effects. And I mentioned early on that we had run a survey with the Society of Human Resource Management. And actually the direct questions for HR professionals helps corroborate what I've just shown you in the administrative data. So when we asked directly about how much information HR professionals have about the outside offers that new hires and existing hires have, they report having limited information, having some frictions in accessing information about that. And we also can run a survey experiment where we ask them, how much are you planning to pay, show them the benchmark, and then let them respond by updating what they expect to pay. And we more or less replicate what we've seen in the administrative data. We also asked our fellow economists to tell us what they expect would happen. And by and large, we discovered that economists were really unconfident about their own forecasts. So for example, only a third of the people that we surveyed actually thought there would be compression in salaries. And I would say that the most accurate result was actually predicting upward pressure in salary levels. So what we've shown is that firms do change the salaries in response to benchmark information. And it's evidence that there are significant information frictions in the marketplace, that firms strategically respond to the wages of other firms, but that they lack information on exactly what their competitors are paying. And it's also evidence that data analytics are very quickly ameliorating these information frictions. So the tool that I described to you today is rolling out very quickly. Like they currently have about 10% market share. And you can see how quickly those data analytics can affect both pay setting, but also just knowledge in the marketplace about wages. So to turn for a moment to the policy discussion. So policymakers believe that there may be pro-competitive and maybe anti-competitive effects of salary benchmarking. And I think today what I've done is formalize a pro-competitive argument. It's certainly true that more research is necessary, but our evidence made us revise our beliefs in favor of salary benchmarking. So we saw less within position pay inequality, and then we saw some gains in the average salary and retention for low skilled positions. So in fact, we can zoom in on a subset of markets where a particular firm has the ability to sort of move strategically the benchmark, but that's actually such a subset of cases. So, it's 3% of cases, so 3% of market cases in our data set that where sort of like the firm can actually move benchmarks in a way that policymakers are concerned about. And so as you can see in aggregate, these salary benchmark tools seem to have quite a pro-competitive effect. All right, so now I will pause and open it up for questions. I can see that there's a hand raised.
Hi, thanks for that presentation, Zoe. So I had a question about the, I guess, the process of wage setting here. Are we assuming sort of like there is no negotiation between the firm and the employee, and like, does the employee get to sort of like offer the firm a bunch of other outside offers saying that, look, this is what firm A, B, C, they're paying me, and you should pay me sort of according to that negotiation strategy? Or are we just assuming that it's like a take it or leave it kind of offer?
Yeah, so in the model that I presented to you, it's the latter. It's just a take it or leave it offer. And that doesn't mean that that's always what happens in the labor market. And in fact, I mentioned and showed evidence that in the high skilled labor market, these type of aggregated wage data seem to play a less significant role in wage setting. And one of the reasons could very well be that there is a back and forth in the sense that the salary benchmark is just one piece of information that can later be superseded by direct evidence on what the counteroffers are. So my sense is that both exist in the labor market, but that in the low skill labor market, in fact, it makes a lot of sense to think about employers having a great deal of uncertainty about what those counteroffers actually are.
I see. Yes, because I guess the a number of counteroffers would sort of lead to better information in some sense. Like the firm can also know what the competitors are paying them. Right? So.
Yeah, exactly. In some sense, it would negate the need for any kind of aggregate wage data.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering about the sort of generalizability to smaller firms. One thing that I was thinking about is that medium to larger firms, assuming that you learn as you hire, will do more hiring and will therefore maybe be able to better learn without the benchmark, like what the equilibrium wage for a particular job is. I don't know if that's true, but that is like one thing that I could imagine being true. Do you think that that's the case?
The most responsive firms in our data set, granted, I mentioned we don't have many small firms, but the most responsive firms are the larger firms. So, and there could be two reasons. One reason could be very aligned with what you're saying, which is that smaller firms, it might be the case that there are specific match components with smaller firms that are more important, so that sort of like one worker's match to a small firm might not be as highly correlated with that worker's match to other small firms. So the information might not be as useful. The other is that you can also imagine for larger firms, small differences in their pay setting decisions have a bigger impact on their bottom line because they're hiring many more people all the time. So it was surprising for us to see that at first, because we thought, well, these big firms, they actually have a lot of experience hiring for each of these positions. And so they have many opportunities to sort of see who accepts offers and when they leave. But it doesn't seem to overwhelm the sort of like the importance of this particular benchmark information. So I don't know if did I capture what you were?
Yeah. Oh, there was a question in the chat about benefits.
Sorry.
Not exactly what that is, but I don't know. Do you think benefits would behave at all differently than base wages? I think Hong Yi's point kind of covered that a bit too.
Well, it's a great question. It's very hard to observe. So actually, I said this and then I discovered new data. So in fact, I take back what I was about to say. It is possible actually in the ADP data to see the contribution of the employer towards worker benefits. And one thing that was pointed out to me, I haven't looked at it yet, but one thing that was pointed out to me was that the important decisions that firms make at the benefits level are typically applied to all workers in the firm, or if not all workers, then large categories of workers. So their choice of basically to adjust the contribution to healthcare benefits or to offer a different set of plans, or the same for retirement plans, is largely inflexible across groups of workers. And a lot of what we see in response to the benchmark is actually fairly specific to like a searched position. So while we haven't yet checked to see if like changes in benefits are co-varying at the same time pay setting strategies are changing, it seems like there's unlikely to be, it's certainly not going to be varied at the same level, at the searched position level. And so you can imagine it has to really affect a large number of people before the firm really adjusts their offers. But I think that's in a bigger picture here question that for sure more research can be very fruitful to sort of exploring how firms decide which part of the package to adjust at the cost of other parts.
May I ask a small b benefit question, which is, what kind of signal was sent about flexibility? I see the low skill, I might be prepared to take a little bit less in benefits if you let me set my own schedule. So when you did that kind of analytics and adjust for flexibility, was there any kind of premium or discount for that sort of attachment to a posting?
Right. Well, to be honest, so I don't have a direct answer to that question. So because I don't have any kind of systematic evidence on flexibility per se, but there is one finding that speaks to this, which is that we're able to see overtime. And one thing we notice very sharply is that after a firm gains access to the benchmark tool, if we restrict attention to the low skill positions, overtime hours actually sharply go down. So we saw wages go up.
That's absolutely a market signal. That's very clear on that. Yes.
Yeah, so I'm not sure exactly how you're interpreting it. So I'm curious what your response would be. But the way we had been thinking about this was that, to the extent that the, sort of existing employees were overextended, prior to these adjustments in salaries, and vacancy fills followed and retention followed. Sort of, yeah. So why don't you speak up, because I realized
all I was saying, having been a minimum wage employee, I mean, planning for overtime hours, they call you in, and that's the premium that they pay for you. But that is a proxy for certain kinds of flexibility, because it means if they're paying overtime, they've done a crap job of allocating hours on this. So that's a clear, and they're required by law to pay a premium for it. So that doesn't 100% answer the question, but it does send a signal about allocation and scheduling capabilities in that regard, which would of course be a proxy for flexibility.
Yeah, and it's consistent with, I think there's even a job market candidate out there who's also finding that amenities, so if you think of flexibility as an amenity, it seemed to go very positively with wages, so that firms are basically offering more of both at the same time, which you might have thought they were substitutes.
Thank you.
Yeah, this has been quite a fun conversation. So if there's, of course, anyone can reach out to me at any time. So thank you very much for hosting me. But if something comes up later, please reach out.